Some homes never welcome you back, and some doors open only to ghosts. The bus rattled down the cracked road into Ashford, Pennsylvania, the rusting steel mills looming like skeletons on the horizon. David Whitaker hadn't seen his hometown in over 20 years. Yet here he was, suitcase in hand, drawn back not by nostalgia, but by a funeral notice. His brother Samuel was dead. The town hadn't changed much. The same sagging houses, the same soot-stained sky, the same silence that pressed on your chest like a weight. But David had changed. Years of wandering had etched lines into his face, left his hands calloused and his heart cautious. At the cemetery, the Whitaker name stood tall on the marble headstone, bold and proud. A small crowd gathered in black, but the weight of old grudges hung heavier than the mourning. Clara Whitaker, the matriarch, stood rigid at the front, his mother, now thinner, colder, eyes sharp as glass. Beside her stood Jonathan, the eldest brother, jaw clenched, his gaze fixed on David like a man spotting an intruder. "You came," Clara said, her voice steady but distant. "After all these years." David bowed his head slightly. "Samuel was my brother." Jonathan's lips twisted. "He was more than that. He carried the family when you walked away. Don't think you can show up now and pretend you belong." The words stung, but David said nothing. The silence between them was louder than any argument. After the service, David lingered by the grave. The wind whispered through the bare trees, carrying fragments of memory, laughter, shouting, fists slamming on the family table. He thought of Samuel's boyish grin, the way he always tried to bridge the chasm between brothers. Now that bridge was ashes. As the mourners drifted away, an old man approached. Sheriff Walter Briggs, retired now, his back stooped, but his eyes still sharp. He rested a hand on David's arm. "I'm glad you came, son. But you should know, Samuel's death wasn't as simple as they say." David frowned. "What do you mean?" The sheriff glanced toward the Whitaker mansion on the hill, its windows dark, watching. "Official word says accident. I've seen enough accidents in my life to know the difference. Be careful, David. Ashford doesn't forget, and the Whitakers don't forgive." The warning gnawed at him. He looked once more at the grave, the earth freshly turned, the name etched in stone. Questions burned where grief should have been. As he walked toward the old family home, suitcase heavy in his hand, he knew one thing with certainty. Samuel's death was only the beginning. From an upstairs window of the Whitaker mansion, someone was watching David's every step, a cigarette glowing in the dark. Every family home holds memories, but some are built on secrets too heavy to carry. The Whitaker mansion loomed at the top of Ashford Hill, its stone walls weathered but still imposing, like a fortress daring time to break it. David's footsteps echoed on the gravel drive, each step dragging up years of silence, arguments, and shame. The front door creaked open before he could knock. His mother, Clara, stood there, tall and severe, her dark dress blending with the shadows of the hall behind her. The Whitaker matriarch had aged, but her presence remained unbroken, like steel forged in fire. "Come in," she said flatly. "We'll not air family business on the doorstep." Inside, the house smelled of polished wood and old tobacco. Family portraits lined the walls, generations of Whitakers staring down with cold eyes, men in suits and women in pearls, their faces proud and hard. The silence inside was suffocating, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Jonathan sat in the drawing room, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He didn't rise. "So, the prodigal son returns. I'll spare you the feast of fatted calf." David ignored the jab and set his suitcase by the wall. "I'm not here for anything but answers." Jonathan smirked. "Then you've already wasted your time. Samuel died in an accident. That's all there is." But Clara's sharp glance at Jonathan betrayed something unsaid. She seated herself by the fire, her hands folded. "Your brother worked late at the mill. Machines fail, men grow careless. That is the end of it." David studied her face. She was lying. He could feel it in the deliberate stillness of her voice. But before he could press, a sound cut through the tension, the shuffle of small feet. A boy peeked into the room, no older than 12. Dark hair, nervous eyes. Jonathan stiffened. "Back to your room, Peter." David blinked. "Who's this?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. "My son. You left before he was born." The boy's eyes lingered on David, curiosity mixed with something else, something unspoken. Then he vanished up the stairs. Clara rose, her voice cutting like a knife. This family has survived scandals, deaths, and betrayals. We will survive this as well. Do not stir what should stay buried." But later, alone in the guest room, David couldn't shake Sheriff Briggs's words, or the look in Clara's eyes. He opened the window, gazing at the lights of the mill in the valley below, their glow reflected in the river like fire. If Samuel's death wasn't an accident, then who in this house was hiding the truth? Down in the basement, unseen by David, a locked cabinet rattled faintly, as though something inside was waiting to be found. The dead may be buried, but their secrets claw their way to the surface. The Whitaker mansion slept under a heavy silence, but David lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Samuel's face haunted him, the boyish grin, the way he always smoothed over fights, the years that ended too soon. He couldn't reconcile that with an accident. Restless, David rose from bed and wandered the halls. The air was colder downstairs, the stone walls damp with age. He passed the dining room, the portraits, and finally, the door to the basement. It was ajar. Curiosity tugged harder than caution. He descended into the dark, the wooden steps groaning under his weight. The air smelled of oil and dust. Shelves lined with boxes and tools loomed out of the shadows. And then he saw it. A tall iron cabinet against the far wall, its door chained and locked. Odd scratches marked the floor in front of it, as though it had been opened recently and hastily shut again. David tried the handle, it rattled but held firm. His pulse quickened. Why lock something so securely in a house filled with family? A faint sound echoed upstairs, footsteps. He froze, straining his ears. The steps grew closer, then paused at the basement door. A shadow stretched across the faint crack of light. "David?" It was Clara's voice, cool and sharp. "What are you doing down there?" He cleared his throat, forcing calm. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd look around." A long pause. Then, "Best not to wander, son. This house holds more memories than you need to stir." The footsteps receded. The door closed. David exhaled slowly, sweat prickling at his temples. He glanced back at the cabinet, frustration burning. Whatever was inside, Clara didn't want him near it. By morning, the house returned to its daily rhythm. Clara issuing instructions, Jonathan gone to handle family business, and young Peter tucked away with his tutor. Over breakfast, David tried again. "Samuel's death doesn't add up," Sheriff Briggs said. Jonathan cut him off. "Briggs is a relic. He sees conspiracies in shadows. Don't waste your time listening to him." Clara's spoon clinked sharply against her teacup. "Enough, both of you. The past is closed. Samuel is gone. What matters now is the future of this family." But David wasn't convinced. Later that afternoon, while Jonathan and Clara were occupied, he slipped into town to find Briggs. The old sheriff sat on the porch of his modest house, pipe smoke curling in the air. "I figured you'd come," Briggs said, eyes narrowing. "What did you find in that house?" David hesitated, then answered, "A locked cabinet in the basement. Something's hidden there." Briggs leaned forward, his voice low. "Then you're closer than you think. Samuel was asking questions before he died, about the mill, about the money, about what really built the Whitaker name. If he found something in that cabinet." He let the thought hang. David felt a chill. "You think he was killed for it?" Briggs's gaze hardened. "I don't think, son. I know. But proving it? That's another matter. Be careful. You're stirring ashes that can still burn." That night, as David returned to the mansion, he noticed Peter watching him from the staircase, clutching a small brass key in his hand. Children often know more than adults suspect, and sometimes they hold the very key to the past. The glow of the chandelier cast long shadows across the Whitaker staircase as David entered the house. His eyes caught Peter's small figure halfway up the steps. The boy stood frozen, clutching a brass key in his hand, knuckles white against the banister. "Peter," David said softly, careful not to startle him. "Where did you get that?" The boy hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the hallway where Clara's voice echoed faintly. Then he slipped the key into his pocket. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. "Grandmother doesn't like it." "I know," David replied. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "But that key, you found it, didn't you? Down in the basement?" Peter's lips trembled. "Uncle Samuel told me never to say. He said it was dangerous." David's breath caught. Samuel had known about the cabinet. And he'd confided in Peter. The boy Jonathan barely acknowledged, the boy hidden away like a shadow. "Listen," David said gently, crouching so his eyes met Peter's. If Samuel trusted you, I will too. But you need to tell me what you know. Peter shook his head, glancing nervously toward the hallway. Not here. They'll hear. A door creaked behind them, and Jonathan's voice cut through the air. Peter, upstairs. Now. The boy stiffened, then bolted up the stairs without another word. Jonathan's eyes narrowed on David. You're meddling again. David straightened, his jaw tight. I'm trying to understand what happened to Samuel. Jonathan stepped closer, lowering his voice to a growl. You don't understand because you weren't here. Samuel was careless. He pried into things he had no right to. You'd be wise not to follow his example. The threat hung heavy, but David refused to flinch. If you're hiding something, Jonathan, I'll find it. And when I do, the truth won't stay buried. Jonathan's smirk was cold, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes before he turned and walked away. Later that night, a light knock tapped at David's door. He opened it to find Peter again, his eyes wide with fear. Without a word, the boy pressed the brass key into David's hand. Uncle Samuel said if anything happened, you'd come back, Peter whispered. He said you'd know what to do. David's chest tightened. He closed his fingers around the key, the weight of it heavier than gold. Thank you, Peter. You've done the right thing. The boy hesitated, then whispered, be careful. They don't forgive. And then he slipped away into the dark. David sat on the edge of the bed, turning the key in his hand, heart pounding. The locked cabinet in the basement was no longer a mystery, it was a summons. Whatever Samuel had found, whatever secret the Whitakers were guarding, the answer was waiting behind that door. As David prepared to use the key, he didn't notice Clara standing silently at the end of the hall, watching with eyes that held both sorrow and warning. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The house was silent, thick with the kind of stillness that makes every creak of wood sound like a warning. Midnight came and went as David crept down the basement stairs, the brass key burning hot in his pocket. The iron cabinet loomed against the far wall, its chains catching the dim glow of his flashlight. He slid the key into the lock. For a moment, he hesitated, hearing Clara's voice in his head, do not stir what should stay buried. But Samuel's face rose before him, and with a sharp turn, the lock clicked open. The chains fell away with a metallic rattle. David pulled the door wide. Inside were files, ledgers, and photographs stacked neatly, too neatly, as if someone had curated them with care. He pulled out the top folder, dust rising as he opened it. What he saw made his blood run cold. Documents, contracts between the Whitaker family and the steel mill, signed with names that traced back generations. Hidden payments, bribes to officials, and cover-ups of accidents at the mill that had claimed workers' lives. The Whitaker fortune wasn't built on steel alone, it was built on silence, blood, and buried truth. David flipped deeper into the pile. Newspaper clippings, never published, detailing a fire at the mill years ago. Witness accounts scratched out, names blacked with ink. And there, at the bottom, a photograph. Samuel, standing in the mill office just weeks before his death, holding one of the same ledgers. His face was tense, wary, as though he knew the weight of what he'd uncovered. David's stomach twisted. Samuel hadn't died in an accident. He'd been silenced. A sound snapped him from his thoughts. The basement door creaked open above. Footsteps descended slowly, deliberately. David shoved the files back into the cabinet, but he kept the photograph in his hand. Jonathan appeared in the half-light, his expression cold as stone. So, you found it. David's grip on the photo tightened. You knew. All this time. Jonathan stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the floor. I didn't just know. I protected it. This family doesn't survive without sacrifice. Samuel didn't understand that. You don't either. David's voice was low but steady. Samuel wanted the truth, and I'll finish what he started. Jonathan's eyes darkened, his voice almost a whisper. Then you've chosen your side. And don't think the family will forgive you for it. Jonathan reached for the light switch, plunging the basement into darkness, followed by the metallic click of a gun being cocked. In the dark, truth and danger feel the same, both sharp enough to kill. The basement went black. David's pulse thundered in his ears as the metallic click echoed in the shadows. Jonathan's voice, low and steady, drifted across the dark. You don't understand what you've opened, David. That cabinet doesn't just hold the past. It holds the future of this family. And I'll bury you before I let you destroy it. David crouched low, fingers brushing against the cold cement floor. The future? You mean lies, cover-ups, blood money. That's what you've been protecting. A shuffle of feet, then Jonathan's breath closer. You think you can cleanse this town with the truth? Ashford runs on Whitaker steel, and Whitaker steel runs on secrets. Always has. The weight of a gun pressed into the silence. David's grip tightened on the photograph of Samuel. He forced his voice steady. That's why Samuel died, isn't it? Because he threatened to pull the curtain back. Jonathan exhaled slowly. Samuel was weak. He thought exposing this would change things. But all it would have done was destroy the Whitaker name. I couldn't let him. Rage boiled in David's chest, but he stayed still. Somewhere above, a faint creak on the floorboards, too light to be Jonathan's weight. Then a whisper, "Peter." Before Jonathan could react, the overhead light flickered on. Clara stood at the top of the stairs, her figure sharp against the glow, and Peter clung to her skirt. "Enough." Clara's voice cracked like a whip. "Put the gun away, Jonathan." Jonathan's jaw tightened, his hand trembling on the weapon. "Mother, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly." Clara descended slowly, her gaze hard. "This family has survived because we controlled what others never dared to. But murdering your own brother? That crosses a line even our name cannot protect." David's breath caught. Clara knew. She had always known. Jonathan's face twisted. "And what then? Let David hand over our legacy to vultures? Let him destroy us?" Clara stopped at the last step, her eyes burning. "Better to lose everything than to lose our souls." Samuel was right. The truth must come. For the first time, Jonathan faltered. His hand lowered slightly, his confidence cracking under the weight of his mother's words. David seized the moment. He lunged forward, knocking the gun from Jonathan's grip. The weapon clattered across the floor. Both brothers fell into a struggle, fists striking, memories of old rivalries exploding into violence. When it ended, Jonathan lay gasping on the floor, restrained under David's weight. Clara stood over them, her face pale but resolute. "The Whitaker bloodline is cursed," she whispered. "But tonight, it ends." Outside, unseen by them, Sheriff Briggs's car pulled quietly into the driveway, ready to hear the truth, or bury it once more. Sometimes justice arrives not as a savior, but as a shadow. The heavy knock at the front door rattled the old house. Clara froze at the sound, her face tightening as if she already knew who stood outside. David kept his hold on Jonathan, whose breath came in ragged bursts. The knock came again, louder. Whitaker residence. Sheriff Briggs. Clara's hand trembled as she motioned for David to stay silent. "Leave him there," she whispered, her voice sharp but fearful. "Let me speak." David reluctantly eased his grip, stepping back. Jonathan rolled to his side, clutching his ribs, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "Mother, don't you see? He's not here to help us. He's here to protect what's his. Ashford doesn't breathe without Whitaker steel, and Briggs is part of the machine." Clara's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. She climbed the stairs slowly, her posture straight, every step echoing through the house like a warning bell. At the door, she opened it just wide enough. Sheriff Briggs stood tall in the porch light, his hat pulled low, his eyes catching every detail. "Evening, Mrs. Whitaker," he drawled. "Mind if I come in?" Clara hesitated, then nodded, stepping aside. Briggs entered, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. His gaze swept the room before settling on the open basement door. "Late night for you folks," he said evenly. "Care to explain?" David emerged from the basement, the photograph of Samuel still clutched in his hand. His voice was firm. "Explain? Sheriff, my brother was murdered. And I have proof." Briggs's eyes flickered to the photo, then to Jonathan, who was dragging himself to his feet. "Murder's a strong word, son. You sure you want to use it?" Jonathan sneered. "Don't listen to him, Sheriff. He's been stirring trouble since he set foot back in Ashford." David stepped closer, thrusting the photo forward. Samuel was silenced because he found out the truth. The ledgers, the bribes, the cover-ups, they're all in that cabinet. This family's fortune is built on bodies, and Samuel died trying to expose it. For a long moment, silence stretched thin as glass. Sheriff Briggs finally took the photo, his rough fingers brushing the edge. His face betrayed nothing. "You know, son," Briggs said slowly, "truth has a way of cutting deeper than lies. Sometimes too deep for anyone to survive it." David's stomach turned. Was Briggs warning him, or threatening him? Clara's voice cut the tension. "Sheriff, whatever has been hidden, it cannot stay buried. My boys are tearing each other apart. If the cost of saving them is exposing our sins, then so be it." Briggs looked at her, his jaw tightening. For a flicker of a second, something human passed through his eyes. Regret, perhaps, or old loyalty. Then he straightened. "I'll need to see that cabinet," he said. Jonathan lurched forward. "You can't. Sheriff, think about what this means for the town. If this gets out, the mill closes, hundreds lose their jobs. Ashford dies." Briggs's stare was like stone. Or maybe Ashford's already been dying, Jonathan, choked by secrets no one wanted to face. He walked toward the basement. Jonathan's lips curled into a snarl. David braced himself, sensing his brother wasn't finished. As Briggs descended the stairs, Jonathan slipped his hand into his jacket and pulled out a hidden blade. Blood can bind a family, or it can drown it. Jonathan's blade caught the faint light as he slipped it free, his eyes locked on David with a feral intensity. The sheriff's boots thudded down the basement stairs, unaware of the storm brewing above. Clara saw the glint of steel first. Her breath caught. "Jonathan, no." But Jonathan moved with the speed of desperation, lunging toward David. The years of simmering rage boiled over in a single thrust. David barely sidestepped, the knife grazing his arm as he slammed his brother back into the wall. The sound of struggle echoed through the house. Briggs spun on the stairs, hand reaching instinctively for his revolver. "Whitaker, drop it." Jonathan's chest heaved, eyes wild. "You don't get it, Sheriff. He wants to burn everything our family built. I won't let him." David, gripping his bleeding arm, spat back. "You call this family? It's rot, Jonathan. Samuel knew it, and deep down, so do you." The words seemed to strike harder than any blow. Jonathan's face twisted with pain, not just from David's grip, but from memory. Samuel was weak, he whispered hoarsely, as if convincing himself. He wanted to betray us all. "No," Clara's voice broke, her eyes glistening. "He wanted to save us." For a moment, Jonathan faltered, the knife trembling in his hand. Briggs leveled his gun. "Last chance, son. Drop it, or I'll put you down." Jonathan's jaw clenched. His gaze darted between David, Clara, and the sheriff. Years of pride and bitterness warred with the flicker of doubt in his eyes. His hand shook. David, voice raw, pressed harder. "You don't have to carry this curse. Let it go, Jonathan. End it here." The knife slipped slightly from Jonathan's grip. Briggs took a step closer, revolver steady. The room was a breath away from violence or redemption. Then, in a voice barely more than a whisper, Jonathan said, "If the truth comes out, we all fall." And he dropped the knife. The blade clattered on the wooden floor, its echo stretching through the house like a sigh. Briggs exhaled and holstered his weapon. David released his hold, though his arm throbbed with pain. Jonathan slumped against the wall, broken, his defiance drained. Clara reached for him, but he turned away, shame pulling him into shadows of his own making. Briggs's gaze hardened. This family's sins aren't just whispers in a ledger anymore. They're evidence, and I'll have to take them in. Clara stood tall, her voice quiet but firm. "Then do it, Sheriff. Let the world judge us. I'm too tired to keep carrying this alone." Briggs descended again into the basement, intent on retrieving the files. David leaned against the stair rail, exhaustion settling heavy on him. Jonathan sat on the floor, staring at his trembling hands. Clara stood between them, a mother watching her sons unravel. For the first time in decades, the Whitaker house was silent, not from secrets, but from the weight of truth finally pressing through its walls. From the basement came a sharp curse from Briggs, followed by silence. When David rushed down, the cabinet stood wide open and empty. A truth lost can be more dangerous than a lie. David reached the basement floor in 3 strides. Sheriff Briggs stood frozen before the iron cabinet, its doors flung wide, chains hanging loose. The shelves inside were bare. No ledgers, no photographs, no files. "They were here," Briggs muttered, his voice sharp with disbelief. "I saw them myself." David's stomach dropped. "Someone took them. But who? We've been here the whole time." Jonathan staggered down the steps, clutching the railing. A bitter laugh escaped his lips. "Did you really think it would be that easy? This family's been burying sins for 100 years. You think papers alone could bring it all down?" Clara followed, her face pale. "Stop speaking in riddles, Jonathan. If you know where they are." Jonathan's smirk faltered. He shook his head slowly. "I don't, but I know Father wasn't careless. He would never keep all the evidence in one place. The cabinet was bait, a test. David's pulse quickened. Then where's the real evidence? Jonathan's eyes burned with an almost feverish light. Buried, just like everything else in this cursed family. Briggs turned on him, jaw tight. If you know something, boy, you'd better spill it now. Interfering with evidence is obstruction, and I don't care how much money your family poured into this town. I'll drag you out in chains. Jonathan raised his hands mockingly. Go ahead, Sheriff. But without those files, what do you have? My word against his? Against hers? Briggs's glare shifted to Clara, then back to David. His voice lowered. Somebody got to this house before we did. Maybe tonight. Maybe years ago. And whoever they are, they're still protecting the Whitaker name. The thought coiled in David's chest like a snake. Another hand in this, unseen, still pulling strings. Then Samuel's death wasn't just family. Someone else wanted him silenced. Clara's lips trembled. There were always allies. Men in suits who visited your father late at night. He said they were investors, but I knew better. They weren't just buying steel, they were buying silence. The room chilled. David felt the walls closing in, the truth slipping further from his grasp. Without the files, without proof, Samuel's death could vanish back into rumor and shadow. Briggs stepped back, his expression unreadable. I'll have to take statements. Lock this place down. But mark my words. The longer the truth stays missing, the less chance you'll ever see justice. Jonathan muttered under his breath, justice is a fairy tale. David snapped, his voice shaking the room. No, Samuel deserves more than silence. I don't care if it's buried in this house, in the mill, or in the graveyard, I'll find it. And when I do, there won't be a Whitaker curse left to hide behind. The words hung heavy in the air. Clara closed her eyes, whispering a prayer that sounded more like a farewell. Above them, a floorboard creaked. Everyone froze. The sound was unmistakable, soft, deliberate steps moving across the second floor. But the Whitakers were all accounted for. Briggs drew his gun, tilting his head toward the stairs. Then we're not alone in this house. In the end, truth is not found, it is paid for. The second floor groaned under unseen footsteps. Sheriff Briggs raised his revolver, motioning for silence. David's heart hammered as he followed, every stair creaking beneath their weight. Clara clutched the banister, her lips whispering Samuel's name as if his spirit lingered in the house. Jonathan dragged himself after them, pale and shaken, though his eyes burned with the stubborn defiance of a man cornered. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched dark and narrow. A faint glow spilled from the old study, the door ajar. Briggs led, revolver steady. David felt a shiver crawl his spine. He had not set foot in that study since his father's funeral. Briggs shoved the door open. Inside, a figure stood at the desk, lantern light casting their face in shadow. Papers lay spread across the oak surface, ledgers, contracts, photographs. The missing files. The intruder turned slowly. It was not a stranger. It was Uncle Richard, their father's younger brother, long thought gone after a quarrel decades earlier. His hair was silver now, his face lined with years, but his eyes were sharp, cunning, and utterly unrepentant. So, Richard drawled, his voice smooth as oil. The children finally stumbled into the grown men's game. David's chest tightened. It was you all along. Richard smiled faintly. I protected this family when your father was too weak to do it himself. I built the deals, kept the mill alive, greased the hands that needed greasing. Without me, there would be no Whitaker fortune. Jonathan stepped forward, his voice raw. You killed Samuel, didn't you? Richard's expression hardened. Samuel was reckless. He would have destroyed everything. I couldn't allow that. Not when the Whitaker name still carried weight. Clara gasped, her knees buckling. David caught her, rage burning through his veins. You murdered him. Your own blood. Richard's lips curled into something between a sneer and a smile. Blood is nothing without legacy. Sacrifice was always the cost. Briggs's gun never wavered. That legacy ends tonight. Put your hands where I can see them. Richard's eyes flickered, calculating. Then, with a sudden motion, he reached into his coat. Briggs fired once. The crack split the room, the smell of gunpowder choking the air. Richard stumbled, a crimson bloom spreading across his chest, and collapsed against the desk. The lantern toppled, papers scattering like frightened birds. David rushed forward, grabbing the files before the flame could spread. Richard wheezed, his last breath rattling. His eyes fixed on David. You think truth will save you? It will bury you deeper than me. Then he was still. The room fell silent except for the distant hum of the mill outside, churning as if nothing had changed. But inside the Whitaker house, everything had. Briggs holstered his gun, his voice grim. The evidence is here. Enough to bury half this town if need be. It won't be easy, but Samuel will have justice. David stood over Richard's body, the files heavy in his hands. He looked to Jonathan, whose face was pale with horror and grief. Clara wept softly, whispering prayers for both the living and the damned. For the first time in years, David felt the weight of choice press down on him. To expose everything meant destroying not only his family's name, but the town itself. To stay silent meant Samuel's death was in vain. He raised his eyes, steady with resolve. The Whitaker name ends tonight. But Samuel's truth will live on. Outside, dawn crept across Ashford, the first light breaking over smokestacks. The last of the Whitakers stood together, broken yet unburdened, as the House of Secrets finally collapsed into history. The Whitaker legacy, born of steel and silence, ended not with fire or fortune, but with truth, paid for in blood.